Here's a sentence written by a sitting American president that Iranian state media replayed for days afterward. Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. That warning from President Trump was not an idle threat. It was followed within days by actual American airstrikes on some of Iran's most critical civilian infrastructure. And it has now happened not once, but across two separate waves of this war, months apart, each one deliberately targeting the bridges Iranian cities depend on to move people and supplies, and the power plants that keep the lights, the water pumps, and the hospitals running. In response, Iranian officials didn't evacuate these sites. They urged ordinary young Iranians to physically form human chains around power plants, hoping their presence alone might deter a strike. It didn't. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly which bridges and power facilities have actually been hit, what the documented human cost has been so far, why the United States adopted this specific targeting strategy in the first place, and what happens next inside Iranian cities that are about to lose even more of the infrastructure keeping them functioning. Stay with me for all of it. Quick note before we dive in. I have spent years studying infrastructure targeting doctrine, the history of strategic bombing campaigns aimed at civilian-adjacent systems, and how modern militaries actually justify and calibrate strikes on dual-use targets like bridges and power plants. That's the lens I'm bringing to you today. Everything in this video is sourced from verified reporting, including the Associated Press, PBS NewsHour, The Washington Post, NBC News, the BBC, and CENTCOM's own public statements. I'll walk you through exactly what has been struck, what Iranian and American officials have each confirmed, and where genuine uncertainty remains about the campaign's actual effectiveness. No hype, no invented casualty figures. Let's get into it. To understand why bridges and power plants specifically became targets in this war, you need to understand the very specific strategic logic that got the United States to this point, because this wasn't the campaign's opening approach. The war began on February 28, 2026, with strikes concentrated on Iran's nuclear facilities, IRGC command structure, and missile production, the kind of targets any observer would expect in a campaign framed around degrading a country's military and nuclear capability. Bridges and civilian power infrastructure did not become priority targets until Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz turned this into a fundamentally different kind of war, one where the central battle was no longer about eliminating Iranian military capability, but about forcing Tehran to reopen a single narrow waterway that a fifth of the world's oil and a quarter of its liquefied natural gas depends on passing through. That shift in strategy became explicit in early April, when a ceasefire briefly held before collapsing under the weight of Iran's continued mining and closure of the strait. On April 5th, Trump issued a direct public ultimatum warning that he would strike Iran's power plants and bridges, specifically if the strait remained closed to shipping, posting online that Iran would be, in his words, living in hell if the waterway wasn't opened. Iranian officials did not simply dismiss that warning as bluster. According to Gulf News reporting from that period, Iran actively urged its own youth population to form human chains around power plants, specifically to try to physically shield them, a genuinely striking image, ordinary civilians linking arms around a piece of national infrastructure in the hope that their presence alone might make American commanders hesitate to strike. It didn't change the outcome. Trump followed through, posting the line that opened this video, describing the coming day as Power Plant Day and Bridge Day combined, and airstrikes that day hit 2 bridges and a train station inside Iran, according to reporting from that same period, while Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian responded by claiming that 14 million Iranians, including himself, had volunteered to fight. The human cost of that first wave of infrastructure strikes in April was significant and well documented. According to detailed casualty tracking from that period, the Karaj B1 bridge, described as the tallest bridge in the entire Middle East and a critical western corridor connecting Tehran to the rest of the country, was struck repeatedly in early April, with casualty reports placing the death toll between 8 and 13 people and 95 wounded, a toll that specifically included civilians who had gathered beneath the structure at the time of the strikes. Separately, Iranian state media reported that a railway bridge near Kashan in central Iran was struck, killing 2 people and injuring 3 more. A highway bridge connecting the cities of Tabriz and Zanjan in Iran's north was also hit and subsequently closed to traffic. And on a broader single day of strikes during that same period, airstrikes across the country killed at least 15 people, while Iran responded by firing missiles at both Israel and Saudi Arabia, an exchange that also forced the temporary closure of yet another major bridge inside Iran itself, this time as a defensive precaution rather than the direct result of American action. If you are finding this breakdown useful, the kind of dated, sourced timeline you're not going to get from a headline simply saying, bridges were bombed, do one thing right now, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this specific targeting strategy returned in an even more sustained form later in the war, and understanding both waves together is essential to understanding where Iranian cities actually stand right now. Now let's fast forward to the second, considerably more sustained wave of this exact same targeting strategy. Because what happened starting in mid-July represents a meaningful escalation beyond the April strikes, both in scale and in how explicitly the United States tied it to a specific, ongoing Iranian provocation. By mid-June, a fragile ceasefire built around the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding had briefly reopened the strait, only to collapse again by mid-July as Iran resumed attacks on commercial shipping. Trump's response was explicit and mechanical, in a way that the April warnings hadn't quite been. According to reporting from military.com, he stated plainly that for every Iranian attack on the strait, a power plant or a bridge inside Iran would be hit in direct response, transforming what had been a one-time ultimatum in April into a standing automatic retaliation formula for the entire remainder of the conflict. The United States followed through immediately. According to the Washington Post's reporting, the U.S. military struck bridges, energy infrastructure, and a port facility in southern Iran overnight on July 17th, the sixth consecutive day of strikes during that renewed round of fighting, with Iranian state media confirming the specific damage. PBS NewsHour's coverage of that same period documented a damaged bridge in Badr Kamir in Iran's Hormozgan province, along with additional energy sites hit and a tower collapsing at a key Iranian port, backing up Trump's earlier threats to specifically target infrastructure until Tehran eased what officials described as its chokehold on the strait. NBC News reporting on this same wave of strikes added a specific detail worth noting closely, that Iran acknowledged attacks on its power infrastructure for the first time that Friday, with the country's own energy ministry publicly asking residents in southern provinces to reduce their electricity consumption. According to the state news agency ISNA, that is a significant admission because it marks the first time Iran's own government confirmed in an official capacity that these strikes were directly affecting the country's electricity supply, rather than simply downplaying the damage as limited or already repaired, the pattern Iranian state media had followed with the April strikes on bridges and rail lines. The same round of reporting documented that a maritime control tower at the port of Chabahar, on the Gulf of Oman, jointly operated with India, was damaged for the third time in recent days, with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth himself posting a photograph on social media showing the tower collapsing amid rising plumes of smoke, a level of direct visual confirmation from an American cabinet official that stands in notable contrast to how quietly infrastructure strikes are sometimes handled in other conflicts. This wave of strikes was not one-directional either. Iran responded to the American infrastructure campaign with its own retaliatory strikes against a key American ally in the region. According to the Washington Post's same reporting, Iranian attacks caused damage to a power and desalination plant in Kuwait, a critical piece of infrastructure for a desert nation that depends on desalination to meet a substantial share of its population's basic water needs. That specific exchange, American strikes on Iranian bridges and power infrastructure, met by Iranian strikes on a Gulf ally's own power and water systems, is the clearest possible illustration of exactly how this war's infrastructure-focused phase has evolved into a genuinely reciprocal cycle, with both sides now willing to target the basic civilian systems the other side, or the other side's allies, depend on to function day to day. If this level of dated, cross-referenced detail is useful to you, the kind that traces exactly which bridge and which power plant got hit on which specific day, rather than a vague summary simply saying infrastructure was targeted, that is exactly the kind of careful tracking I intend to keep providing on this story as it continues to unfold, because the specifics here genuinely matter for understanding how deep this targeting campaign has actually gone. There's a specific human dimension to the April infrastructure threat that deserves its own closer look, because the image of ordinary Iranian civilians forming human chains around power plants tells you something important about how this specific war has been experienced on the ground, beyond just the strike statistics themselves. According to the BBC's Persian service reporting from that period, ordinary Iranians were grappling directly with Trump's threat in real time, with one presidential aide dismissing the ultimatum as insults and nonsense born out of what they described as sheer desperation and anger, a defiant public posture from Iranian officials, even as the underlying threat was treated seriously enough to prompt an actual civilian mobilization campaign. That combination, public official defiance paired with a genuine, organized civilian protection effort, tells you that Iranian authorities themselves were operating with real uncertainty about whether Trump's threat would actually be carried out, hedging between projecting confidence for domestic audiences and preparing, however symbolically, for the possibility that it would. It's worth being clear-eyed about what a human chain around a power plant can and cannot actually accomplish against a modern precision-guided munition, because the gesture itself carries more symbolic and political weight than genuine physical protective value. A chain of civilians standing near a facility does nothing to prevent a satellite-guided bomb from finding its target with the same precision it would have used regardless of who was standing nearby. And multiple examples across the history of modern warfare have shown that human shield strategies, whether organized by civilians spontaneously or orchestrated by governments specifically to deter strikes, have had a genuinely mixed record of actually changing and attacking militaries' targeting decisions. What the human chain campaign really represented was a form of psychological and political signaling, both to the Iranian public, demonstrating that ordinary citizens were willing to physically stand behind the regime's infrastructure, and to the international audience watching this war unfold, framing any subsequent American strike as one that would have to be carried out in full knowledge that civilians had specifically gathered at the site to protect it. Now here's the piece of this story that I think deserves the most attention, because it's the part that connects these specific strikes directly to what ordinary people living in Iranian cities are actually about to experience. And it's a mechanical, almost unavoidable chain reaction once you understand how these systems actually work. A bridge is not simply a convenience that makes a commute faster. In a country like Iran, where much of the interior is mountainous and many population centers depend on a limited number of major crossings to move fuel, food, medical supplies, and emergency services between regions, destroying a specific bridge like the Karaj B1, described as the tallest in the entire Middle East and a critical western corridor out of Tehran, doesn't just create a traffic inconvenience. It can functionally sever or dramatically slow the movement of exactly the kinds of supplies a city depends on to keep functioning normally, at precisely the moment a wartime economy already under strain needs that movement to be faster and more reliable, not slower and more constrained. The same logic applies to the railway bridge near Kashan and the highway connecting Tabriz to Zanjan, both now damaged links in a national transportation network that has comparatively few redundant routes to fall back on when a specific crossing goes down. Power plants carry an even more direct and immediate cascading effect, one we've discussed in detail in previous coverage of Iran's broader energy crisis. Iran's electricity grid already faced a severe structural deficit before any of these specific infrastructure strikes ever happened, driven by decades of underinvestment and heavy reliance on aging thermal plants. Every power facility taken offline by an American strike adds directly to that existing shortfall. And because Iran's water pumping and treatment network runs on that same overstretched grid, every blackout that results from these strikes doesn't stay contained to households losing their lights. It very often means the water taps in the same neighborhood stop working at the exact same moment, since the electric pumps that maintain water pressure through the pipes underneath these cities simply cannot function without a reliable power supply. That is precisely the mechanism behind Iran's own energy ministry publicly asking southern provinces to cut back on electricity use following the July strikes, an acknowledgement that the country's power supply had been pushed even further past its already strained capacity. Hospitals sit at the sharpest edge of this exact chain reaction. Facilities that depend on backup generators to keep dialysis machines, ventilators, and refrigerated medications running during a blackout are themselves dependent on a steady fuel supply to keep those generators operating through an extended outage, a fuel supply that Iran's own separately documented gasoline and refinery crisis has made considerably less reliable than it would be in ordinary peacetime conditions. When you combine damaged bridges slowing the movement of medical supplies and fuel between regions, damaged power plants deepening an already severe electricity shortfall, and a national fuel crisis limiting how long hospital backup systems can actually run, you get a genuinely compounding civilian crisis that extends well beyond the immediate blast radius of any individual strike, reaching into hospital wards and water taps in neighborhoods that may be hundreds of kilometers away from wherever the actual bomb landed. There's also a legal and humanitarian dimension to this specific targeting strategy that deserves careful, honest treatment, because bridges and power plants occupy a genuinely complicated category under the laws of armed conflict. Under international humanitarian law, a target qualifies as legitimate military objective if its destruction offers a definite military advantage, a standard that can, in some circumstances, extend a dual-use infrastructure like bridges and power plants when they serve a genuine military logistics function, moving troops and equipment, or powering military command and communication systems alongside their civilian uses. That legal framework is precisely why American officials have consistently described these strikes using language like logistics infrastructure and military capability degradation, rather than framing them as attacks on civilian systems directly, a distinction that carries real legal weight even when the practical, on-the-ground effect on ordinary civilians living near or dependent on these same facilities is severe and well documented. Legal experts who study this exact category of targeting have long noted that the actual test under international law depends heavily on the specific military use each individual facility serves, and on whether the anticipated civilian harm from a strike is proportionate to the concrete military advantage gained a case-by-case legal analysis that rarely translates cleanly into the kind of simple, universal judgment either side of a public debate over war like this one tends to want. What's clear from the documented record we've walked through today is that these specific strikes have produced real, measurable civilian casualties and real, measurable disruption to water, power, and hospital systems, regardless of how the underlying legal classification of any individual bridge or power plant ultimately gets resolved by military lawyers and potentially by international bodies reviewing the conduct of this war after it eventually ends. Let me pull back now and give you the honest, strategic assessment of whether this specific targeting approach of bridges and power plants in direct retaliation for Iranian attacks on shipping is actually accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish, because I think this is where the campaign's own internal logic runs into a genuinely difficult problem. The stated strategic goal of this entire infrastructure-focused phase of the war has always been narrow and specific: to pressure Iran into reopening the Strait of Hormuz to normal commercial traffic. Trump's own public framing has consistently tied these strikes directly to that goal, describing them as a direct mechanical response to Iranian attacks on shipping, rather than a broader campaign of general punishment. But the actual pattern of events across both April and July tells a more complicated story about whether that pressure is actually working as intended. Despite the April round of bridge and power plant strikes, Iran did not permanently abandon its blockade posture, instead reaching the June ceasefire through a separately negotiated diplomatic agreement rather than through infrastructure pressure alone. And that same ceasefire collapsed within roughly a month regardless, leading directly into the July round of even more intense infrastructure strikes. If the goal of destroying bridges and power plants was to make continued blockade activity too costly for Iran to sustain, the fact that Iran resumed exactly that same blockade behavior within weeks of the ceasefire being signed suggests the infrastructure pressure alone has not, at least so far, been sufficient to permanently change Tehran's underlying strategic calculation about the value of controlling the strait. There's a historical parallel worth considering here, because the United States is not the first military in modern history to bet heavily on infrastructure and civilian-adjacent targeting as a way to break an adversary's will to continue fighting. Strategic bombing campaigns against German and Japanese industrial and transportation infrastructure during the Second World War operate on a similar underlying theory: that destroying the physical systems a population depends on would eventually force capitulation faster than targeting military forces alone. Post-war historical analysis of those campaigns produced a genuinely mixed and still debated verdict, finding that infrastructure bombing did meaningfully degrade production capacity and complicate military logistics in both countries, but that it took considerably longer to translate into actual shifts in political will than campaign planners originally expected, and in some documented cases appeared to harden civilian resolve rather than break it, at least in the short term. That historical debate doesn't tell us with certainty how this specific campaign against Iran will ultimately play out. The technology, the specific targets, and the political context are all different. But it does suggest a note of genuine caution about assuming that visible, dramatic infrastructure damage automatically and quickly translates into the kind of strategic capitulation a bridge and power plant retaliation formula is explicitly designed to produce. Beyond the immediate blackouts and transportation disruptions, Iranian cities are facing a slower, more grinding challenge that gets far less attention than the strikes themselves: the sheer difficulty of actually rebuilding this kind of infrastructure while the war remains ongoing. Iranian state media has, in multiple documented instances following the April strikes, been quick to report that damaged roads and tunnels were already under repair, or that alternative routes had been established to reconnect affected southern regions with the rest of the country. A pattern of rapid, publicly announced repair efforts clearly intended to project resilience and normalcy to both domestic and international audiences. But rebuilding a major bridge like the Karaj B1, described as the tallest in the entire Middle East, is not a project that can realistically be completed in weeks, even under ideal peacetime conditions, with unlimited access to construction materials, skilled engineers, and heavy equipment. Iran is attempting this kind of infrastructure repair while simultaneously fighting an active war, managing international sanctions that restrict access to certain construction materials and specialized equipment, and diverting significant government resources toward military spending rather than civilian reconstruction. That combination means the gap between an official announcement that a route has been repaired or an alternative established, and the underlying reality of whether that repair actually restores anything close to the original capacity and safety of the damaged structure may be considerably wider than Iranian state media coverage suggests. This same rebuilding challenge applies with even greater force to power infrastructure specifically. A modern power plant, particularly one that's been directly targeted rather than simply damaged by nearby blast effects, often requires specialized components, transformers, turbines, control systems, that Iran's own domestic manufacturing base may struggle to replace quickly, especially under the same sanctions regime that has already constrained the country's energy sector for years before this war ever began. That means every power facility taken offline by these strikes may represent not simply a temporary interruption, but a meaningfully longer-term subtraction from Iran's already severely strained electricity generating capacity, one measured in months or years of reduced capacity, rather than the kind of rapid repair timeline state media announcements sometimes imply. And here is why this should matter to you, wherever you're watching this from, even if you've never thought about Iranian bridge infrastructure before today. This targeting strategy carries genuine humanitarian stakes that extend well beyond the specific military and diplomatic goal it's meant to serve. Every account we've walked through today, the Karaj Bridge casualties, the Kashan railway deaths, the Kuwaiti desalination plant damaged in direct retaliation, the Iranian Energy Ministry's own public admission of strained electricity supply, points toward the same underlying reality: that a strategy explicitly designed to inflict enough cost on Iranian infrastructure to change Tehran's strategic calculus about the Strait is, by its very design, also inflicting direct and compounding costs on ordinary Iranian civilians who have no direct control over whether their government chooses to keep the Strait open or closed. This dynamic also isn't staying contained within Iran's own borders, which is worth remembering given how directly the Kuwaiti desalination plant strike illustrates the point. Once both sides in a conflict adopt infrastructure retaliation as an explicit standing strategy rather than a one-time punitive measure, the civilian populations of neighboring countries allied with either side become directly exposed to exactly the same kind of cascading water and power disruption we've documented inside Iran itself. Kuwait's own citizens were urged to ration electricity following the strike on their power and desalination facility, a direct echo of the same appeals Iran's own energy ministry made to its southern provinces after the American strikes on its power infrastructure. That symmetry, both populations facing similar appeals for conservation following retaliatory infrastructure strikes, is a genuinely sobering illustration of how quickly this specific style of warfare can spread its civilian costs across an entire region, well beyond the two primary combatants directly negotiating over the future of the Strait itself. That tension between a targeting strategy's stated military logic and its actual documented civilian impact is not unique to this specific war, but it is playing out here in a particularly visible, well-documented way, with specific bridges, specific casualty figures, and specific power plants that we can trace and verify, rather than remaining an abstract policy debate. Before you go, two things. First, if this breakdown gave you the dated, sourced clarity you weren't getting from a headline simply saying Iran's infrastructure was hit, share it with one person trying to understand both the strategic logic behind this campaign and its real human cost. That's the only way careful, balanced reporting like this reaches more people than the noise does. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think this bridge and power plant retaliation formula is likely to eventually force Iran to permanently abandon its blockade of the Strait? Or do you think the pattern we've already seen, infrastructure, strikes followed by a temporary ceasefire followed by renewed blockade activity within weeks, suggests this specific strategy has already reached the limits of what it can actually accomplish? Drop your assessment below. I read every one of them. Here is where things stand. Since early April of 2026, the United States has carried out two separate sustained waves of strikes specifically targeting Iranian bridges and power infrastructure. First, following Trump's direct ultimatum warning of a combined power plant day and bridge day, and again beginning in mid-July after the Islamabad ceasefire collapsed and Trump established a standing retaliation formula striking a bridge or power plant for every Iranian attack on shipping in the Strait. Documented casualties from these strikes include between 8 and 13 deaths and 95 wounded at the Karaj B1 bridge alone, additional deaths at a railway bridge near Kashan, and at least 15 killed in a single day of broader strikes in early April. The more recent July wave saw Iran's own energy ministry publicly acknowledge, for the first time, that American strikes were directly affecting the country's power supply, while Iran retaliated by striking a power and desalination plant in Kuwait. The mechanical chain this creates inside Iranian cities is direct and well documented. Damaged bridges, slowing the movement of fuel and medical supplies between regions, damaged power plants, deepening an already severe structural electricity deficit, and that deficit directly threatening water pressure and hospital backup systems in cities far from where any individual bomb actually landed. Whether this targeting strategy ultimately succeeds in permanently forcing Iran to abandon its blockade of the Strait, the explicit goal behind it, or whether it simply becomes another prolonged, costly chapter in a war that keeps cycling between ceasefire and renewed escalation, is the question this campaign's own continuing results will keep answering in real time. I'll keep tracking every part of it closely, and I'll bring you the next update the moment there's something real to report.